I wasn't looking to become a death penalty lawyer when I arrived at Harvard Law School in 1983. I was 19 years old, uncertain about my path, haunted by the civil rights issues I had long felt drawn to but knew I did not understand. When a professor encouraged me to sign up for an intensive course on race and poverty litigation, I agreed, never imagining what awaited me that winter in Georgia. I found myself sent alone to death row in the rural western reaches of the state, assigned to meet a condemned man named Henry. My heart pounded as I drove through pine-covered roads toward the high-walled prison at Jackson. I tried to prepare myself for what I would say. But when I met Henry, he was desperate for a simple promise that he would not be killed in the next year. I fumbled through my apology and reassurances, but when I told him the truth, he broke into a song he had learned long ago in church. His baritone rose clear and strong as he sang, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." The prison guards resumed shoving him away before he finished, but even in that small visitation room, the hymn took on new meaning. In a moment, Henry's courage and generosity changed my life. His song became my song, my own urgent resolve to get closer to the condemned and incarcerated, to understand the laws and practices that allow extreme punishment, and to discover how justice might be found in places of despair. What followed was 3 decades of working on the front lines for people condemned to die and those facing extreme sentences. I saw firsthand how proximity to the convicted and incarcerated forced me to confront basic questions I had often thought about from a distance. Why are some people judged unfairly? How do race, poverty, and power shape our most serious punishments? What is the measure of our commitment to justice? What happens to us when we allow rage, fear, and anger to imprison us more than any jail cell can? Above all, I learned that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done, and that mercy is most powerful when it is directed toward those who least deserve it, or so society claims. Here is some of what I learned, distilled from my cases, my clients, and those I've worked with in courts and prisons across America. By the 1980s, America was embracing an unprecedented commitment to harsh punishment. Our prison population exploded from about 300,000 people in the early 1970s to 2.3 million today. We sent tens of thousands of people to die in prison. Not long after executions restarted in the 1970s, we created new crime categories, invented slogans like 3 strikes, removed parole, and passed devastating laws that trapped people in prison for disease, for addiction, for poverty-driven offenses, and even for unintended acts like writing a bad check. Across America, nonviolent offenders found themselves in prison for decades. Thousands more were condemned to death, simply because they were accused of crimes against white victims. Poor people were presumed guilty. They were condemned by the barbed logic of prison and forgotten by the rest of us. Public resources shifted from schools, healthcare, and conservation to fund jails and prisons, now consuming nearly $80 billion a year, versus just $6.9 billion in 1980. Private prison companies, drug treatment contractors, and prison healthcare providers profited mightily from the misery we created. Testing DNA in the late 1980s began exposing wrongful convictions. Over 300 innocent people have been exonerated by DNA testing. Many of them, I'm sorry to say, were on death row. But despite proof of innocence, many of these people had to wait years or decades for justice. They were aided by heroic non-governmental organizations and brave pro bono lawyers. Meanwhile, countless others waited in prison for their day in court, with no understanding of where their cases stood or who to ask. Thousands of prisoners passed away before their records could be corrected or convictions overturned. Many more suffered terrible miscarriages of justice. They were poor or people of color. Case by case, we saw how the lack of competence in appointed counsel, presumptions of guilt, and racial bias in jury selection supported a conviction culture that allowed innocent people to die in prison. My introduction to this world began that cold December afternoon in 1983 when I was that nervous law student walking into Jackson State Prison, fearing that I'd be dismissed as too young, too inexperienced, and too white to help condemned prisoners. I quickly learned that it was an error to expect or demand anything of a wrongly accused prisoner, but I could at least try to listen and speak the truth I had been given by the committed lawyers of the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. I ended my Harvard years convinced that law school can be deeply alive if it is informed by the lives of the poor and racial discrimination, close to the most vulnerable among us. I returned to the Deep South after graduation with the same sense of awe that I had experienced upon meeting Henry. I started a death penalty project in Tuscaloosa, then moved to Montgomery and founded the Equal Justice Initiative in 1994 in order to provide free, high-quality legal representation to condemned men and women on death row in Alabama, and to advocate for truth and reconciliation about America's history of racial violence and legal repression. From a cramped office in downtown Montgomery, our legal staff took on all the condemned prisoners whose execution dates were scheduled and anyone claiming innocence, but without counsel. We also represented hundreds of prisoners pleading mental health care abuse, prisoners abused in solitary and locked in sweatboxes, juveniles locked in adult prisons, and children sentenced to die in prison. Before founding EJI, I had handled many capital cases across the South, assisting condemned people just minutes before their scheduled electrocutions. I've endured multiple prison visits and jails in remote counties, witnessed the eagerness of some prosecutors for fast executions, observed the flagrant racial bias in jury selection, studied the damage wrought by mandatory life sentences on our youth, and spoken with hundreds of victims who believed the justice system had failed them or battered people who abused their authority. I've tried to learn from officers who became prison wardens and prosecutors who believed they were doing their best to serve the law. And I've heard many stories of these officials, pained by a job that daily damaged their own health and morality. Some of the most memorable people I've represented suffered appalling childhood trauma. Many of the women on death row who killed someone they loved, like Walter's ex-wife, who was incarcerated for killing a man who sexually assaulted her. A boy handed around foster homes who was wrongly convicted of starting a fire that killed 2 children, small children, sentenced to die in prison for driving a man to a store where another man killed a clerk. Intellectually disabled young men with no idea of the gravity of their actions, children who endured vicious abuse in prison. Each of these forgotten children taught me about the power of empathy and the need for compassion in our justice system. I have witnessed the triumph of saving someone wrongly convicted and the terrible waste of executing innocent or disabled people. I have learned how essential it is to confront our racial history of terror, the legacy of slavery and lynching, segregation and Jim Crow, and its continuing impact. I have talked with victims of violence whose pain has deepened when we fail to respect the humanity even of those who brutally harmed them. I have also seen how the vilest criminals sometimes seek to heal themselves in prison and embrace a measure of redemption. In all these experiences, I have heard countless songs of sorrow, pain, fear, anger. But I have also heard enough hymns, jazz, rap lyrics, and blues laments to give me confidence that there is light in this darkness if we are willing to open our eyes. One of the most transformative experiences in my life was the Rule 32 hearing we held for Walter McMillian in Baldwin County in 1992. In that hearing, a previously silent condemned man named Ralph Myers suddenly recanted his damning testimony, admitting that he had lied and that he had been threatened by police to testify against Walter. He said police had told him, "If you don't testify the way we want you to, you'll go on the electric chair." He joyously admitted, "I lied. I lied. Everything I said at the trial was a lie." We confronted the state's other witnesses and showed how their testimony had also been false, uncovered by hidden files and records long withheld from the defense. It was one of the most remarkable court proceedings I have ever witnessed. Scores of witnesses exposing the lies and misconduct that had led an all-white jury to send a black man to death row in a case with no evidence but Myers's perjury. Yet, after a 3-day hearing on the facts, the circuit judge refused to grant relief. But the public uproar and national press coverage compelled the Court of Criminal Appeals to reverse and give Walter a new trial. Only then, after hundreds of times I had driven miles of back roads in South Alabama and spent thousands of hours in prison visiting McMillian personally, did Walter finally gain a new trial, a chance to demonstrate his innocence, and on direct appeal, a ruling to overturn his conviction and death sentence. After 6 years in prison, he walked free on February 24, 1993. It was a moment that lifted all of us who had labored for his case, and showed how sometimes legal institutions, when confronted with the truth, can find a way to set an innocent person free. I returned to Albany, New York, to teach at New York University's law school in 1994, and I moved the EJI office to its permanent home in Montgomery. When I first went to Montgomery in the winter of 1994, the city had just started to deal seriously with the racial terrorism of the 1960s. It was the 50th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. After law school, many of my classmates enrolled in advanced public policy programs before launching their lives. I found Montgomery's legal community inspiring. largely because younger lawyers seem to want their lives to connect with legitimate experiences of justice and morality, rather than solely to enhance their bank accounts or the search for privilege. They were intrigued by the stories of younger leaders like John Lewis and Rosa Parks, and the way they had organized ordinary people to stand up in the face of brutal repression a generation earlier. In the years since then, I have been privileged to meet many of those heroes: Ralph Abernathy, John Lewis, Diane Nash, James Lawson, Bernard Lafayette, Amelia Boynton, Joanne Robinson, Fannie Lou Hamer, Bob Zellner, Susie and C.K. Steele, Virginia Durr, Fred Gray, attorneys like Fred Gray and Charles Langford, and even Chief Justice Earl Warren, whom I met once while on a fellowship in Washington. Sitting at a breakfast table with these leaders is an experience of living law, studded by moral urgency and conviction. I have tried since then to be true to that pioneering spirit of the civil rights movement, the model of lawyering and advocacy that deeply connects personal life with public action and uses law as an instrument of justice rather than an academic abstraction. I have carried on that spirit in writing about civil rights history and the continuing fight for racial equity, in speaking to students, and in reaching out to people in small towns who live amid the conditions that were the focus of much of my earlier work. I have also tried to connect the work of civil rights leaders and the quest for racial justice with the modern problems of mass incarceration and extreme punishment. Over the last 30 years, the death penalty has been abolished in 30 states and the District of Columbia. In the 38 states that still allow death sentences, far fewer people are receiving them. In some death penalty states, executions have ended, and in many the pace of executions is slowing. At the same time, life imprisonment without parole has emerged as the dominant form of ultimate punishment for murders. Nearly 3,000 people are now serving life without parole sentences for crimes committed when they were children, and over 250,000 people are serving decades in prison for nonviolent offenses. More than 50,000 people are serving life without parole sentences nationwide. Over 80% of them are people of color. Most of them are poor, too sentimental to seek appeals, or simply unaware of the legal arguments that could change their sentences. I've argued innocence and sentencing cases in over a dozen states, tackling issues from forfeiture laws and money laundering to racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct, or the surprising ways that we still exclude Black people from juries in death cases. I believe that everyone should have a chance to demonstrate who they are, to ensure that, when we condemn a person, we have done so responsibly. Our sentencing choices must be accountable, transparent, and fair. When they are not, innocent and vulnerable people suffer. When they are not, we all suffer. A commitment to justice cannot be measured by how we treat the strong, the powerful, or the privileged among us. It must be measured by how we treat the weak, the persecuted, the poor, the disabled, and the condemned. Geographically and virtually speaking, our law schools, congressional chambers, corporate boardrooms, most courtrooms, and bar associations are dominated by those who are privileged and unafraid. But ours is a society in which an estimated 68 million people, or more than 1 in every 4 adults, have criminal records that block access to jobs, housing, and the right to vote. We have become a nation in which being convicted of a misdemeanor still shatters someone's life, even though almost no one today is sentenced to death for crimes inside a grocery store. The United States puts more people in jail than any other nation, and we exercise our power to punish with very little conscience or reflection about whether the punishments we impose on the poor are even serving our collective interests. A few voices call out for reform, but meanwhile more people are jailed for drug offenses than have died on the battlefield in our war in Afghanistan. The laws that created incarceration and extreme punishment have become brutal, impersonal, and cruel. But the courageous soul of the law, the commitment to equal dignity and respect for every human being, is still there waiting to be rediscovered. Sometimes it is found in a prison cell by a condemned man. Sometimes it is found beside a judge who quietly rules that a conviction must be overturned after all the evidence is in. Sometimes it is found in a battered woman who eventually escapes her abusers and becomes a counselor for others. Sometimes it is found in an addict who recovers and finds new life. Whatever form it takes, it is built on the willingness to look at people in terms of their humanity, not merely as labels of race, poverty, disability, or crime. My work across this strange country, and in faraway places, has made me more hopeful about what human beings are capable of. I have a series of unqualified, and sometimes naive convictions that guide me. First, each of us is more than the worst thing we have ever done. Each of us needs mercy, and perhaps thanks to our own brokenness, We understand the power of mercy better than we understand the power of punishment. Second, fear and anger can make us destructive, cruel, and abusive. We must guard against the impulse to punish in order to relieve our fear, rather than to make us safer. Third, our collective conscience is vitiated if we allow the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned to be mistreated, whether by law enforcement officers, public officials, or elected leaders who exercise our power. When we allow their mistreatment, we diminish or destroy our own humanity. Fourth, we all have a role to play in our justice system. We are shaped by each other, by our laws, and by our culture. We are responsible for how justice is administered, for whether our laws are just, whether our courts are fair, and whether the most vulnerable among us have access to help when they need it. Finally, hope is not just a wish. It's an act of resistance. It's a strategy. It's an orientation of the mind. It offers the courage to be broken and a path to healing. In the process, it creates change for the better. Love is the motive, but justice is the instrument. These words by Reinhold Niebuhr have guided me from the start. Cases matter. Rule 32 hearings matter. Supreme Court decisions matter. But ultimately, people must matter more than cases and law schools and laws and prisons. People must always matter more than these instruments of justice, even when our instruments fail. Because if people aren't central, we have nothing left to measure. No way to know whether the law is just, no place from which to launch our protests, and no hope of a world that finds humanity in all our brokenness. It seems to me that if we want mercy and justice to work, we have to stand beside people who suffer pain, people who cry for justice, people whose lives have been broken by racism, poverty, or violence. We must bear witness. We must show up. We have to get close. This book is about getting close to people whose life stories most of us would rather ignore or fear. It's about facing the most uncomfortable truths about our justice system and our shameful lack of mercy. It's also about hope, because getting close to mass incarceration and extreme punishment reveals that there is light in the darkness, and it's enough to cheer us all.